A house does not forget what it has swallowed. It only waits for someone patient enough to dig it back up.
No, this cannot
Martha
be true.
Fenwick had cleaned Rendmore Hall 1,000 times over. She knew every board that groaned, every draught that crept under which door, every place the dust gathered, no matter how many times she chased it away. She knew the particular smell of the study, beeswax and pipe tobacco, and, underneath both, the cold mineral breath of old stone that no fire ever fully warmed. She knew this house the way a woman knows her own hands. Tonight, for the first time in 11 years of service, her hands would not stop shaking. The Duke had left for London an hour before. Martha had stood at the scullery window and watched the carriage lamps shrink to 2 orange pinpricks on the drive, and she had counted, out of some old, useless habit, every minute since the sound of the wheels had faded into the dark of the moor road. 41 minutes. 42. She told herself she was only finishing the study grate. That was true, as far as it went. The Duke did not permit the maids near his study when he was in residence, and so the ash built up for weeks at a time, and when he finally left for the city, someone had to go in and set it right, before it choked the flue entirely. Martha had drawn the short straw, or perhaps no straw at all. Perhaps Mrs. Pruitt simply trusted her most, out of all the girls, not to touch what she oughtn't. Mrs. Pruitt was not wrong to trust her. Martha had never touched what she oughtn't. Not once in 11 years. She knelt at the hearth with her bucket and brush, and it was only by accident. She would tell herself this for the rest of her life. Only by accident. That her fingers found the seam in the carved stone edge of the mantle's base. She had seen him there before, more than once, crouched in exactly this spot when he believed the room was empty, his hand resting against the stone, the way a man rests his hand against a door he does not want to open in front of others. She had never wondered why. A maid who wonders about her employer does not stay a maid for long. But her thumb found the seam now, and the seam gave a fraction under the pressure, and something in Martha, something that had been quiet and obedient for 11 years, refused to pull her hand away. The panel came loose with a groan that felt far too loud for an empty house. She froze, certain the sound would bring someone running. No one came. The house held its silence the way it always did, patient and indifferent, the way houses hold everything. Behind the stone, a small iron box, locked, and beside it, tucked flat against the cavity's back wall, a single folded letter. Its wax seal had been cracked once, and pressed back down in a hurry, the wax cooling unevenly, as though whoever resealed it had been listening for footsteps the whole time. Martha's breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. She should put it back exactly as she'd found it. She should close the panel, finish the grate, and go to bed, and in the morning this would be nothing more than a strange half-memory she'd never mentioned to anyone. She was a maid. She dusted. She swept. She did not read her master's hidden correspondence by firelight, with her heart hammering in her throat. Instead, she unfolded it. The matter is settled as you wished. Braddon House, past Ashfell, will hold her as long as you require. It is 3 days' ride from anywhere that matters, and the physician there asks no questions so long as his fee arrives each quarter. The magistrate's report on her banishment has been buried these 24 years, and no one living can contradict it now, save perhaps your wife, and she suspects nothing of her own mother's fate. Should your wife ever learn what you did, or what you and your father did together, remember you need only one signature more. Dr. Whitmore owes you his practice and his silence. A wife committed to Braddon House cannot testify. She cannot inherit. She cannot even be believed. The law does not ask if she is mad. It only asks if her husband says she is. Martha read it once, and her mind slid off the words like rain off glass, refusing to hold their shape. She read it a second time, and the shape began to form, jagged, wrong, impossible. She read it a third time because some stubborn, disbelieving part of her insisted that the words must mean something gentler than what they plainly said. They did not. He had not simply stolen a woman's name, her freedom, 24 years of her life. He had built himself a door, a trapdoor, hinged and oiled and ready, that he could drop his own wife through the instant she became inconvenient, using the very same asylum where her mother had been rotting, forgotten, in a town most maps no longer bothered to name. Martha thought of her mistress downstairs at this very hour, embroidering by candlelight in the drawing room, with the patient stillness of a woman who had long ago stopped expecting her evenings to hold anything interesting. Lady Charlotte Ashcombe, Duchess of Rendmore, 28 years old, who believed, because she had been told so as a girl of 4 and had never once been given reason to doubt it, that her mother had abandoned her, disgraced herself, vanished into scandal and shame, and never looked back. Not gone, alive. Locked behind a boarded window 3 days' ride past Ashfell, waiting for a rescue that was never, ever going to arrive on its own, because the only 2 men who knew where she was had spent 24 years making certain it never would. Martha folded the letter back along its worn, tired creases. Her hands had stopped shaking. Something colder, steadier, had taken the shaking's place. She would not put it back. She would not burn it either, though some frightened animal part of her whispered that burning it was the only safe thing left to do. She was still crouched at the hearth, the letter warm against her palm, when she smelled the smoke. It came thin at first, curling under the study door in a grey ribbon so faint she might have imagined it. Martha had spent enough winters coaxing stubborn chimneys back to life to know the difference between a flue drawing badly and something else entirely. And this was something else entirely. By the time she reached the corridor, the ribbon had become a wall, and somewhere below, muffled through 2 floors of stone, someone was already screaming for water that would not come fast enough. She did not think. She shoved the letter into her bodice, felt the paper crackle against her skin, and ran. The east wing was already lost. She could see that from the gallery window, a hungry orange light licking up along the old timber where the newer additions met the original hall, the fire finding every dry, forgotten beam the house had accumulated across 300 years. Servants poured from the side doors in nightclothes and bare feet, clutching whatever they'd managed to grab in the panic of waking to smoke. Martha turned back once, toward the study, toward the hearth where the loose stone still stood open. But there was nothing left in that room worth saving. The letter was already hers. Everything else could burn. Outside, in the wide gravel sweep of the drive, Lady Charlotte stood in her dressing gown with her hair unpinned and streaming loose down her back, staring up at the flames eating through the roof of the only home she had ever known. Her whole life lit orange against the black sky. She did not weep. Martha would remember that for the rest of her days, that her mistress simply stood, very still, as though some part of her had already understood, long before tonight, that this house had never truly belonged to her either. Martha found her hand in the chaos of running footmen and screaming grooms and pressed the folded, smoke-scented paper into it. "Read it when you're safe," Martha said, her voice steadier than she had any right to feel. "Not now, but read it. And then, my lady, we'll need horses, 3 days' worth." "Martha, what is this? What's happened to you? You're shaking." "Your mother isn't gone, my lady," Martha said, and she watched 24 years of quiet, buried grief crack open across her mistress's face in the space of a single sentence, the way ice cracks across a pond when the weight upon it finally becomes too much. "She's alive, and I know exactly where he's kept her." Behind them, the house that had swallowed so many secrets over so many decades began, at last, to fall in on itself, taking with it every lie the Duke had so carefully mortared into its stones, every letter he'd thought safely hidden, every debt he'd thought forever unpaid, every lie, that is, except the one Martha now carried folded against her heart, already on its way to undo him entirely. They left before dawn, before the fire had even finished smouldering, before anyone thought to ask a lady's maid and a duchess in borrowed travelling clothes where they were bound. Charlotte had wanted to wait, to send word to her husband, to summon the magistrate, to do something that felt like the proper shape of a crisis. But Martha had taken her by both shoulders in the grey pre-dawn light and said the only thing that could move her. "Every hour we wait, my lady, is an hour he has to reach Braddon House first. He'll have had word of the fire by now. He'll wonder what survived it." That had been enough. Charlotte had gone still, the way she had at the drive that night, and then she had gone to find riding boots that fit and a purse of coin that hadn't burned, and within the hour they were mounted on two of the estate's steadiest horses, riding north and west into moorland that grew wilder and greyer with every mile. The mistress had hardly spoken since the fire, not since Martha had pressed the letter into her hands and watched her read it by torchlight in the ruin of what had been their courtyard, watched her go pale, then furious, then something harder and colder than either. She had read the words Braddon House and past Ashfell so many times over the first day's ride that the paper had begun to soften and blur along its folds, the ink threatening to lift entirely from the crease. 24 years, Charlotte said finally, on the second night, staring into the small, mean fire they'd managed to coax from wet moorland scrub. "He let me believe she'd abandoned me. He let me hate her, Martha. I used to lie awake as a girl and hate her for leaving me. I built a whole grief around a woman who never left at all." "He needed you to hate her," Martha said, turning a strip of dried meat over the flame. "A daughter who hates her mother doesn't go looking for the truth of where she's gone. Hatred is easier to manage than grief. Grief asks questions. Hatred just wants to be left alone with itself." Charlotte looked at her across the fire for a long moment. Really looked. The way one looks at a person one has employed for years without ever quite seeing. "You've thought about this a great deal, for a maid who only found the letter yesterday." "I've thought about very little else since the age of 9, when my own mother stopped being spoken of in my father's house," Martha said, and did not elaborate, and Charlotte, to her credit, did not press. There was a kind of understanding that passed between them in that silence, not mistress and maid any longer, not quite, but two women who had each, in their own way, been taught to stop asking about the people they'd loved and lost. By the third day, the road had gone from rutted to barely a road at all, a thin scratch of a track through moorland, so grey and forgotten that the world itself seemed to have stopped bothering to remember it existed. They passed no coaching inns, no toll houses, nothing but the occasional hunched shepherd's hut and the wind, which never once stopped. "You never told me why you opened that letter," Charlotte said, near the end of the third day, when Ashfell's first crooked chimney had just come into view over a rise of heather. "You could have put it back, closed the panel, said nothing. You'd still have your position. You'd still be safe." Martha considered the question longer than she needed to, because the honest answer felt too large for the size of the moment. "I opened it because I have spent 11 years in that house, learning exactly which doors I was permitted to open, my lady, and exactly which ones I was not. And I have grown very tired of being the sort of woman who only opens the permitted ones." Charlotte said nothing to that, but she rode a little closer for the rest of the way, until their stirrups nearly touched. Ashfell, when they finally reached it, was 3 buildings and a church, with no congregation left to fill it, a place so thoroughly forgotten that even its own name seemed to have given up trying to matter. Braddon House sat a mile further on, low and grey and long, with bars across windows that had once, perhaps, in some earlier and gentler decade, been meant for something other than a prison. The physician who answered the door was younger than Martha had expected, younger and greedier, his eyes going straight to Charlotte's fine, if travel-worn riding habit, doing the swift arithmetic of a man assessing exactly how much a well-born visitor might be persuaded to pay for his cooperation, or his silence. "We've come for a patient," Charlotte said, and her voice was steadier than Martha had heard it in 3 days of hard riding and harder truths. "A woman committed 24 years ago under a false name, on the order of the Duke of Rendmore. I'm not permitted to discuss the patients under my care," the physician said, already drawing the door narrower, already reaching for the latch. "This is a private institution, madam, and I'll thank you to—" Martha stepped forward before he could finish and held up the letter, not the whole of it, only enough to show the crack of the Duke's own seal, enough of his own hand in the careful, damning script, and watched the man's face change entirely, the greed curdling instantly into something closer to fear. "You'll discuss this one," Martha said, "or you'll discuss it with a magistrate instead, along with the matter of your quarterly fee arrangement, which I believe is also mentioned here, Dr. Whitmore, in some considerable and specific detail." He let them in. The corridor beyond smelled of damp stone and carbolic soap, and something underneath both that Martha did not want to name. Whitmore led them, wordless now, past a row of locked doors, some silent, one weeping softly behind its bars, until he stopped before the last door in the row and fumbled with a ring of keys that shook audibly in his hand. The woman they found inside was thinner than Martha had pictured, grayer, quieter than any description could have prepared either of them for. 24 years does not forgive a person gently, and it had not forgiven her at all. She sat by the single barred window in a chair that had clearly once been a fine piece of furniture, now worn threadbare, her hands folded in her lap in a posture of such patient, practiced stillness that it broke something in Martha's chest just to witness it. But when she looked up and saw the face standing in her doorway, something in her seemed to remember, all at once and with terrible force, that she had once had an entire life outside these 4 grey walls. "Charlotte?" she whispered, a name Martha had never once heard used for her mistress in 11 years of service, a name from some earlier, unstolen life, before the Duke, before the title, before any of it. Charlotte crossed the small room in 3 unsteady steps and knelt at her mother's side, and for a long moment neither of them said another word at all. Martha stood in the doorway and let them have it. That silence, that reunion, that grief, finally allowed to become something other than grief. Dr. Whitmore hovered at Martha's shoulder, wringing his hands. "I want no part of this," he said quietly, as though confessing to a priest rather than a lady's maid. "I never wanted any part of it. He came to me 11 years ago, when I'd just taken over the practice from my father, and by then it was already done. The ledgers, the fees, all of it, established before I ever had a say." "Then you'll have every opportunity to say so," Martha said, "to the magistrate, and it will go rather better for you if you say it first, and clearly, and with your ledgers in hand, rather than waiting until we've no more need of your cooperation." He went very pale, and very quiet, and very cooperative indeed. That first night, once Whitmore had retreated to his own quarters, and the house had gone as quiet as a place like Braddon House ever truly went, Martha found herself alone in the corridor outside Eleanor's room, unable to make herself walk away, and unable, quite, to make herself go in. She had spent 3 days riding toward this moment with a certainty that had carried her through exhaustion and fear and the long grey miles of moorland, and now that the moment had arrived, she discovered she had nowhere left to put that certainty. It simply sat in her chest, heavy and unspent. It was Eleanor who found her there, in the end, come to the doorway in a borrowed shawl to see who was pacing outside her room at such an hour. "You're the one who found the letter," Eleanor said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, my lady." "Come in and sit then. You look as though you've not slept since you found it, and I find I owe a debt to the woman who did what my own son-in-law spent 24 years ensuring no one would." Martha sat, stiffly at first, in the chair Charlotte had occupied hours before, and Eleanor studied her with the same patient attention she'd turned on her daughter's face when she'd first said her name. "You have the look of a woman who has done this before," Eleanor said. "Opened a door she wasn't meant to open, I mean. Paid for it once already." Martha had not intended to say anything of her own history. It had never once seemed her place, in 11 years of service, to speak of it to anyone above her in the household. But something in the quiet of that room, in the particular understanding of a woman who had herself spent a quarter century being told her own voice did not matter, loosened something in her chest, that had been tightly wound since she was 9 years old. "My mother left my father's house when I was 9, Martha said. "Not the way your ladyship's mother was made to leave. She simply walked out one morning and never came back, and my father told the neighbors she'd died of a fever, and told me, when I was old enough to ask properly, that she'd never loved either of us enough to stay. I believed him for a long while. I was very good at believing what I was told, my lady. It's rather the whole of what makes a good servant, believing what you're told and asking nothing further. And now I find I've rather lost the knack for it," Martha said, and Eleanor, for the first time since they'd found her, laughed. A small, rusty sound, but a real one, and it seemed to Martha the finest thing she had heard in 3 days of hard riding through wind and grief. They did not speak of it again that night, but something had shifted between them, quietly and permanently, the way a stone shifts once its true weight has finally been tested. And when Charlotte came looking for her mother an hour later and found the two of them sitting together in easy silence, she did not ask what had passed between them. She only sat down on the edge of the bed and joined it, and for a little while, the three of them simply stayed together in that narrow, barred room, saying nothing at all, needing to say nothing at all. They stayed at Braddon House 3 days, long enough for Charlotte's mother, Eleanor, her name was Eleanor, a name Charlotte repeated to herself over and over, as though relearning a language she'd forgotten she once spoke, to gather what little strength the journey home would demand of her, and long enough for Martha to go through Dr. Whitmore's ledgers page by trembling page, copying out every entry that matched a date to a payment that matched, in turn, to a line in the Duke's own hidden letter. It was on the 3rd night that the rider came. Martha heard the horse first, a hard, driven gallop, entirely wrong for the quiet of Braddon House's usual traffic, and she was at the window with a candle, snuffed before the second knock had even finished sounding at the door below. She recognized the man dismounting in the moonlight instantly. Greaves, the Duke's own steward, a man Martha had served alongside for 6 years and never once trusted. "He knows," she said, turning to find Charlotte already awake, already reaching for the dressing gown draped over her mother's chair. "He sent Greaves ahead of himself. He'll be no more than a day behind." "Then we leave tonight," Charlotte said, and there was no tremor left in her voice at all, only the flat, cold resolve of a woman who had spent 3 days learning exactly how much her husband had taken from her, and exactly how little more she intended to allow. They did not leave quite fast enough. Greaves found them in the stable yard, saddling the horses by lantern light, Eleanor already bundled against the cold in Charlotte's own borrowed cloak. He stood in the archway with his hat still dripping from the ride, and for a moment no one spoke at all, only the horses shifting, and the wind, and the small, terrible silence of a man deciding how much force his employer's name still carried. "His Grace sends his compliments," Greaves said finally, "and asks that her ladyship's mother remain exactly where she is found, for her own health and safety, until his Grace can arrange for her proper care." "Her proper care," Martha said, stepping between Greaves and the horses without quite deciding to do it, "has consisted of 24 years locked behind a barred window a mile past a village that doesn't appear on any map His Grace's solicitors would ever consult. I think we've seen quite enough of His Grace's arrangements, Mr. Greaves." "I'm not here to argue with a lady's maid," Greaves said, and there was a warning in it now, a shift in his weight that Martha recognized from every man who had ever decided a woman's objections were merely noise to be waited out. "Then argue with her ladyship," Martha said, "and with the letter I am carrying in my own hand, in His Grace's own writing, which I am entirely prepared to read aloud to whichever magistrate we happen to encounter first on the road home. You may tell him that, if you'd rather ride back with something useful to say." Greaves looked past her to Charlotte, to the Duchess herself, mounted now, straight-backed, her mother settled before her on the saddle, with an arm wrapped protectively around her, and something in that image, a Duchess and her lost mother, and a maid standing between them, and a steward's threats, seemed finally to persuade him that this was not, in fact, an argument he had been sent to win. He mounted his own horse without another word and rode back the way he'd come, and Martha did not for one moment believe they had seen the last of it. They did not wait to find out. They rode through what remained of the night and did not stop again until Ashfell was 3 days behind them, and London's outskirts, grey and smoke-hazed, had begun to rise ahead. Chapter 6. Confronting the Past. The Duke was waiting for them at the townhouse. He stood in the hall when they arrived, travel-stained, exhausted, 3 riders and 1 recovering woman who had not slept properly in a week, and for a moment Martha thought he might simply order them all turned back out into the street. He had that look about him, the particular cold stillness of a man calculating exactly how much of his life had just come apart, and exactly how quickly he might still be able to nail it shut again. "Charlotte," he said, and his voice carried the practiced warmth of a man greeting a wife returned from an ordinary visit to relations, as though the past week had not happened at all. "Thank God. When I heard about the fire, I feared the very worst. And who is this you've brought with?" "You know precisely who this is," Charlotte said, and her voice did not shake at all. "You've known for 24 years exactly where she was, and exactly what you and your father did to put her there, and exactly what you intended to do to me the day I became inconvenient enough to warrant the same." The Duke's face did something complicated. A flicker of genuine alarm quickly smoothed back over into wounded confusion, the expression of a man rehearsing innocence in real time. "I don't know what you imagine you've—" "We have the letter," Martha said, stepping forward before he could finish building his denial. "Your letter, Your Grace, in your own hand, describing Braddon House and Dr. Whitmore's fee, and the signature you meant to force from him the day her ladyship became inconvenient. We have Dr. Whitmore's ledgers to match every payment to every date you specified, and we have her ladyship's mother, alive, willing, and entirely capable of testifying to a magistrate exactly how she came to spend 24 years behind a barred window under a false name." The Duke's eyes moved from Martha to the letter she now held plainly in view, and something in his composure finally, visibly, cracked. "You've no notion what you've done," he said, and his voice had dropped its warmth entirely now, gone flat and dangerous, in a way Martha had heard before, late at night, through study walls she'd been told never to listen at. "You are a maid. You have interfered in matters that are none of your—" "I have interfered," Martha said, "in a matter of a woman locked away for 24 years on nothing but her son-in-law's word, and I find I am not the least bit sorry for it, Your Grace, and I do not intend to become sorry for it, no matter how loudly you'd like to explain to me why I ought to be." For one long, suspended moment, Martha genuinely believed he might strike her. She had seen that particular tightening in a man's jaw before, in her own father's house, in the years before she'd learned to read it and get out of the room. But Charlotte stepped forward first, placing herself squarely between them, her mother's hand still gripped tight in her own. "You will not touch her," Charlotte said. "You will not touch either of us again. You will sit down, and you will listen, because the magistrate arrives within the hour, and you may spend that hour deciding whether you'd rather explain yourself to him as a man who cooperates, or as a man who does not." The Duke sat. For a long moment he said nothing at all, his eyes moving between the 2 women and the letter in Martha's hand, as though he might yet find some angle of it he hadn't already considered. When he spoke again, his voice had changed once more, the warmth and the anger both stripped away, leaving only something quieter and, in its way, more dangerous. "My father built this," he said. "The arrangement, Braddon House, all of it. It was his doing, long before I ever had a hand in any part of it. I inherited it the way I inherited the title. What was I meant to do, Charlotte? Undo 20 years of my father's arrangements the moment I came into the estate, and risk every debt, every alliance, every—" "You were meant to tell me the truth," Charlotte said. "You were meant, at the very least, not to renew the arrangement in your own hand, with your own signature, 11 years into our marriage, describing precisely how you might use the very same asylum against me." "Your father is dead, Your Grace. He has been dead for 6 years. You had 6 years in which to close that door yourself, and instead you kept it oiled and ready." "A man protects what's his," the Duke said, and for the first time, something almost like genuine feeling entered his voice. Not remorse, Martha thought, but something closer to wounded pride, the particular outrage of a man who has never once had to explain himself and finds the experience intolerable. "The estate, the title, the name, I did what was necessary to protect all of it, and I make no apology for." He stopped himself, and for a moment something else moved behind his eyes, quick and unguarded, gone almost before Martha could name it. "My father took me to Braddon House once," he said, more quietly now, not quite to either of them. "I was 9 years old. He wanted me to see it, so I'd understand what happened to people who made trouble for this family. I understood it very well, Charlotte. I understood it for 30 years. He looked up, and whatever had cracked open in him closed again just as fast. I did not build that door. I was only ever taught to keep it oiled. Then you had 30 years to decide you would not teach your own children the same lesson," Charlotte said, "and instead you decided to renew it, in your own hand, against me. Whatever your father made of you, Your Grace, the signature on that letter is entirely your own." "You protected yourself," Martha said quietly, "at the cost of a woman's entire life, twice over, and I think, Your Grace, you have said quite enough now on the subject of what's necessary." He looked at her then with an expression she recognized instantly, and had spent 11 years learning to make herself small in front of the particular contempt a certain kind of man reserves for a servant who has forgotten her place. But something in her had changed since the night she'd found the loose stone, and she found she no longer had any instinct left to make herself small in front of it. "You'll lose everything," he told her, and it was meant, she understood, as a threat rather than an observation. "Your position, any reference you might hope for. No respectable household in England will take on a maid who found a letter proving her employer meant to lock his own wife away the moment she became inconvenient," Martha finished for him. "I find I am prepared to risk that particular reputation, Your Grace, and I rather suspect it is not my own that ought to concern you tonight." News of the fire had already reached London by the time they arrived, but news of what the fire had uncovered had not yet, and for a strange, suspended week, the three of them lived inside a silence that felt almost peaceful, a held breath before the town learned there was anything worth gasping over. It did not stay silent for long. Whitmore's cooperation, once secured, could not be kept quiet indefinitely, and within a fortnight, the story had begun its slow crawl through drawing rooms and dinner tables across the city. A duke, a hidden asylum, a mother-in-law presumed dead for a quarter century. By the time the formal charges were filed, half of London already believed some version of the truth, and the other half believed something considerably more scandalous, embellished by every retelling into a tale of murder, madness, and buried fortunes that bore only a passing resemblance to the facts. Charlotte bore the attention with a composure that astonished even Martha, who had spent 6 years believing she knew the full measure of her mistress's character. Invitations arrived and were declined. Callers came to the door under the thin pretense of concern, and were received, when they were received at all, with a cool civility that gave them nothing to carry back and repeat. It was Eleanor, oddly, who seemed least troubled by the whole business, a woman who had spent 24 years being talked about by no one at all, found she had little patience left to spare for being talked about by everyone. "Let them whisper," Eleanor said one evening, when Charlotte had come back from a rare social call, looking drained and brittle. "I spent 24 years being erased entirely, my dear. I find I would rather be gossiped about than forgotten. At least gossip requires them to admit I exist." It was during those 4 months of waiting, solicitors, depositions, the slow grinding machinery of the law, that Martha watched her mistress change in earnest. The Charlotte who had once sat quietly embroidering by a drawing-room window, patient and contained and entirely unremarkable to anyone who did not look closely, began to disappear, and in her place grew a woman who read every deposition herself before it went to council, who corrected her own solicitor twice on points of the marriage settlement he had gotten wrong, who sat across from her husband's barrister in a preliminary hearing and answered his questions without once looking away. "You've become rather formidable, my lady," Martha told her one evening, only half in jest, as they sat together going through yet another stack of papers by lamplight. "I've become someone I was always capable of being," Charlotte said, not looking up from the page. "I simply never had cause to find her before." "It's remarkable, Martha, how much of a person can go undiscovered, simply because no one ever needed her to appear." Martha thought of the loose stone, and the seam her thumb had found almost by accident, and said nothing, though she suspected Charlotte understood the thought regardless. Not every consequence of those months was so easily borne. Charlotte's aunt, her father's sister, arrived unannounced one afternoon in a hired carriage still spattered with the mud of the London streets, and swept into the parlour before the footman had even finished announcing her, already speaking. "You cannot possibly intend to see this through to a courtroom," her aunt said, drawing off her gloves finger by finger, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had rehearsed the opening of this conversation the whole way over. "A newspaper readership, Charlotte. Our name spelled out beside the word asylum, for every tradesman's wife in London to read over her breakfast. Your father would be mortified." "My father is not here to be mortified," Charlotte said, not rising from her chair. "And I find I have rather more sympathy just now for a woman who spent 24 years locked behind a barred window than for a family name that might have to endure one difficult season of gossip. A discreet retirement to the country for your husband, his title held in trust until—" "Until what, Aunt Prudence? Until everyone has kindly forgotten what he did, and he's permitted to come home again once the talk has died down." Charlotte's voice did not rise, but something in it had gone very flat and very final. "You are asking me to protect the comfort of a man who kept a signed letter describing exactly how he meant to erase me, the same way he erased my mother. I have spent 4 months learning precisely how much of my life was arranged around other people's comfort, and I find I have none left over for yours." Her aunt's mouth tightened. "You will find yourself entirely alone in society once this is done. No one forgets a scandal of this size." "I have already been entirely alone in society, Aunt Prudence," Charlotte said. "I simply didn't know it until 4 months ago. I find I would rather be alone with the truth than surrounded by people who'd prefer I kept quiet about it." She rose then and rang for the footman herself. "You may see yourself out. I believe your carriage is still waiting." Her aunt did not return, though she wrote twice more in the weeks that followed, each letter shorter and colder than the last, urging the sane, quiet retreat in increasingly bare terms. Charlotte burned the second one unread, the paper curling black in the grate, while Martha watched from the doorway. "She would rather I stayed married to a man who meant to lock me away the moment I became inconvenient," Charlotte said, watching the paper curl to ash in the grate, "than see our name mentioned in a newspaper column. I find I have very little use for a family that measures its honor that way." The magistrate was an older man named Price, dry and unhurried, the sort who had seen enough of the aristocracy's private arrangements over 30 years of practice to have grown entirely immune to being impressed by a title. He listened to the letter read aloud in full. He examined Dr. Whitmore's ledgers, which Martha had copied out page by careful page, and which Whitmore himself, true to his word, had confirmed under his own signature, rather than risk the alternative. He listened, longest of all, to Eleanor. She spoke for nearly an hour, in a voice grown rusty from disuse but steady beneath the rust, describing the night 24 years ago, when she had first begun asking questions her husband's father had not wanted asked. Questions about accounts that did not balance, about a marriage settlement that had somehow vanished from the family solicitor's records, about a young duke's father who had needed a signature from a young duke's mother-in-law that she had refused, again and again, to give. "They told my daughter I had abandoned her," Eleanor said, and here, for the first time in the whole long recitation, her composure finally wavered. 4 years old. I begged them to let me write to her, even once, even a single line she'd be too young to remember later. They told me a mad woman's letters would only frighten a child. I have spent 24 years believing my own daughter grew up hating me, and being told that was a mercy, that it was better than the alternative. Price made careful notes throughout, his pen scratching in the quiet drawing room, and when Eleanor finished, he set the pen down and looked at the Duke for a long, unhurried moment. "Your Grace," Price said, "I have practiced law in this county for 31 years, and I confess I have rarely encountered a case constructed with quite such thoroughness against its own perpetrator. A letter in your own hand, a physician's ledgers matched precisely to your own correspondence, a magistrate's report, your father's doing, I understand, though you have plainly continued the arrangement, buried for 24 years, and now very much unburied, and a witness, alive and entirely lucid, ready to testify to every particular. This is a private family matter," the Duke said, and even he seemed to hear how thin the words sounded in the room. "A misunderstanding between... A woman does not require 24 years and a barred window to resolve a misunderstanding," Price said. "I believe, Your Grace, we are well past the point where that particular defense will serve you. The case took 4 months to come before the courts in full, and in those 4 months, Martha watched her mistress transform in ways she would not have believed possible of the quiet, embroidering woman she had served for 6 years. Charlotte spent her days with solicitors and her evenings with her mother, relearning her in slow, patient increments. A shared love of walking in bad weather, a habit of humming while she worked, that Charlotte discovered, astonished, she had inherited without ever knowing its source. The Duke tried, twice, to offer settlement. Once through his own solicitor, proposing a quiet arrangement that would see the matter dropped in exchange for a sum large enough to secure Eleanor comfortable lodgings for the rest of her days, provided she agreed never to speak of Braddon House again. Charlotte refused within the hour of hearing it. "We is not buying my silence a second time," she told Martha, the letter of offer torn neatly in two upon her writing desk. "He bought 24 years of it once already. I find I have run entirely out of silence to sell him." The second attempt was less genteel. A man Martha did not recognize approached her directly outside the solicitor's offices one grey afternoon, offering, with the particular oiled courtesy of a man used to such errands, a sum that would have set Martha up comfortably for the remainder of her life, in exchange for a single missing ledger page, one that happened to connect a certain quarter's fee rather too neatly to a payment from the Duke's own private account. Martha looked at the sum named and thought, briefly and honestly, of every year she had spent scrubbing another family's grates for wages that never quite stretched far enough. Then she thought of a woman in a barred room, repeating a name she'd been forbidden to speak for 24 years, and she told the man, with perfect courtesy of her own, precisely where he might deliver his employer's offer instead. She did not tell Charlotte of the offer for a full week, and when she finally did, over tea in the small parlour that had become, in the months since the fire, something closer to a place where the three of them, Charlotte, Eleanor and Martha, sat together as equals than any room Martha had ever occupied in service. "You should have told me at once," Charlotte said, though there was no real reproach in it. "I didn't want you to spend a week wondering whether I'd taken it," Martha said. "Some things are easier said once they're already settled." The trial itself, when it finally came, lasted 3 days. The Duke's counsel argued illness, misunderstanding, a father's long-dead sins wrongly laid at a son's door. He was, counsel insisted, a man who had inherited a terrible arrangement he lacked the will to dismantle, rather than a man who had maintained it, quarter by quarter, with his own signature and his own coin, for 11 years of his own marriage. The prosecution began, on the second day, by calling Martha herself. She had not expected to be called at all. She was, after all, only the maid who had happened to find the letter, and she had assumed her part in the matter would end with the copied ledger pages she'd already submitted. But Price had insisted, gently, that the court would want to hear directly from the woman who had first opened the panel, and so Martha found herself standing before a crowded gallery of London's better society, all of them craning to see the servant who had apparently brought down a duke. "You understood when you found this letter," the prosecuting counsel asked her, "that reading it, and keeping it, could very well cost you your position, and perhaps a good deal more besides." "I understood that, yes, sir." "And you read it regardless. Why?" Martha thought of the question longer than the courtroom's silence seemed entirely comfortable with, but she had learned, over the past 4 months, that a true answer was worth a moment's delay. "Because I had spent 11 years in that house being trusted with everything except the truth of what happened inside it," she said finally. "I dusted the study every week of my employment there, and never once wondered what the hearth might be hiding, because I had been taught, very thoroughly, that wondering was not my place. I think I simply grew tired of it, sir, of not wondering. It seemed, that night, as good a time as any to stop." There was a stillness in the gallery after that answer that Martha would remember for years afterward. Not quite sympathy, not quite admiration, but something closer to recognition, as though a good number of the well-dressed women watching from the benches had, at some point in their own lives, understood exactly what she meant, and never once been permitted to say it aloud themselves. The prosecution laid out the letter next, then the ledgers, then Whitmore's testimony, delivered in a low, ashamed voice that nonetheless matched every date and figure to the letter's own claims, without a single contradiction. Greaves gave his reluctant corroboration of the errand he'd been sent to ride, plainly uncomfortable to be doing so under oath, but unwilling, in the end, to perjure himself on his former employer's behalf. The Duke himself took the stand on the 3rd day, against, it was rumored, his own counsel's advice. He answered the early questions with the same wounded, aristocratic composure he'd worn at the townhouse, a man inconvenienced by circumstance rather than accused of anything he considered a genuine crime, until the prosecuting counsel asked him, plainly, why a man who claimed to have inherited an arrangement he found distasteful had nonetheless renewed its terms, in writing, in his own hand, 11 years into his marriage. The Duke was quiet for a long moment. When he answered, something in his voice had changed. Not remorse, still, Martha thought, watching from the gallery, but something closer to the truth arriving late and unwelcome, the way it sometimes does when a man runs out of better answers to give. "Because I was afraid of her," he said, and the courtroom went very still. Not of what she'd do, of what she'd become, if she ever stopped needing me. My father taught me that a wife who depends on nothing is a wife you cannot control, and I built my entire marriage on the fear of losing that control. I told myself it was protection. I have had 4 months in a cell to consider that it was never anything but fear, dressed up in a duke's language so it would sound like duty. He looked, briefly, toward where Charlotte sat, and for once did not seem able to hold her gaze. I am not asking to be forgiven for it. I understand now there isn't a version of this where I should be. It was, Price noted afterward, the first entirely honest thing the Duke had said in the whole of the proceedings, and it did not save him. The law did not concern itself with a man's fear, only with what he had done because of it. But Martha noticed that Eleanor, watching from beside her daughter, did not look away from him either, as though even now she would not grant him the small mercy of being simple enough to hate without complication. And last of all came Eleanor herself, dressed in deep, quiet grey, her hands folded in the same patient posture Martha had first found her in, though her voice now carried none of that room's silence. I do not ask the court for sympathy, Eleanor said, in the closing moments of her testimony, looking directly at the man who had signed the papers that stole 24 years from her. I ask only that the law finally do what it should have done a quarter century ago, and ask whether a husband's word alone is sufficient to erase a woman entirely. I do not believe it should be. I do not believe it ever should have been. The Duke was convicted not for the forged committal papers alone, nor for the quarter century of fraudulent fees paid to keep a physician's mouth shut, but, the judge was careful to specify, in a ruling that made the London papers for a full fortnight, for the deliberate, sustained theft of a woman's liberty, on nothing more than his own signature and his father's before him. He was sentenced to the very institution he had once wielded so easily against others, though this time there would be no quarterly fee arriving to buy his comfort, and no signature left in all of England that anyone would still believe. Whitmore lost his license to practice, but avoided prison himself. His cooperation and his ledgers weighed carefully against the 24 years he'd allowed to continue, rather than the years he'd begun them. Greaves left service entirely, and was not, so far as Martha ever heard, missed by anyone. Charlotte inherited what remained of the Rendmore estate in her own right, the marriage dissolved by Act of Parliament in one of the swiftest such proceedings anyone's solicitor could recall. The sort of speed, Price observed dryly, that only ever seemed to arrive once a case had already become impossible for polite society to look away from. The papers that had once delighted in speculating about scandal now delighted, with equal enthusiasm, in reporting the verdict. The Duchess and the Buried Mother, one headline read, above an engraving of Braddon House's barred windows that bore only a rough resemblance to the actual building, but conveyed, Martha supposed, the general idea well enough. Society's opinion, so quick to whisper doubt during the 4 months of waiting, proved equally quick to reverse itself once the verdict was read aloud, and Charlotte found herself, in the strange way of these things, rather more sought after as a dinner guest in the weeks following the trial than she had ever been as a duchess in good standing. She declined every invitation just the same. Whitmore's ledgers, entered whole into evidence, went on to serve a second purpose beyond the courtroom. Price, methodical to the last, used them to trace 3 other names besides Eleanor's, 3 other women committed to Braddon House over the preceding decade, under arrangements that bore an uncomfortably similar shape. 2 were found still living. Their families were notified, though not all of them, Martha learned later with a familiar, weary bitterness, were especially eager to have the matter reopened. Rendmore Hall itself was beyond saving. The fire had taken the east wing entirely, and left the rest too scarred and smoke-blackened to be called a home again. Charlotte did not mourn it long. It was never truly mine, she told Martha, the 2 of them standing together at the edge of the ruin, on the day the solicitors finally released the property for demolition. It was his, and his father's before him, and every secret in it was theirs too. I'd rather build something that's only ever been mine. Chapter 11. A New House. They rebuilt on the old estate's ashes that spring, a smaller house, plainer, honest in its proportions in a way Rendmore Hall had never once managed to be. Eleanor chose the site herself, on a rise that caught the morning light and looked out over moorland rather than toward the road. Because, she said, I have spent quite enough years of my life facing toward whoever might be arriving to collect me. Martha stayed on, not as a maid, in the end, though it had taken Charlotte 3 separate and increasingly insistent conversations to convince her of the change. She managed the new household's affairs entirely, kept its ledgers with the same fierce precision she'd once turned on Dr. Whitmore's, and sat, most evenings now, in the same small parlor as the 2 women whose lives she had, quite by accident, pulled back from the fire together with her own. The new house had no locked doors. It had no hidden panels behind its hearthstones, no letters folded away to be found by a maid with steadier hands than her fear. Every room stayed exactly what it appeared to be, and Martha, who had spent 11 years learning which doors a woman like her was permitted to open, made certain, this time, that it would remain that way for good. Eleanor spent her mornings in the garden she had planted herself, slowly, with the particular fierce patience of a woman relearning what it felt like to choose her own hours. She grew heather along the southern wall, the same wild moorland heather that had lined every mile of the road from Braddon House, and when Martha once asked her, gently, why she'd want a daily reminder of that road at all, Eleanor only smiled and said that a road that leads a person home is not the same thing as a road that leads them away, and she saw no reason to forget the difference. Charlotte took up the running of the estate in full. The tenant farms, the accounts, matters she had never once been permitted to touch in her marriage, where such things had always belonged, by unspoken and absolute agreement, to her husband alone. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she had a talent for it, a patience with figures that matched Martha's own, and the two of them spent long evenings that first year going over the new estate's ledgers together at the same table, correcting each other's sums, arguing amiably over the wisdom of a new roof for the tenant cottages, until the work of running a household stopped feeling like anyone's singular burden and became, instead, something the three of them simply did together, the way families do. Word came, once, that the Duke had died within the walls of the very institution to which he'd been sentenced. A letter from Price, brief and businesslike, informing them of the fact, as a matter of legal record, rather than anything requiring their grief. Charlotte read it standing by the window, and set it down without any particular ceremony, and went back to the ledger she'd been reviewing before it arrived. "Nothing?" Martha asked, watching her. "Nothing," Charlotte agreed. "I gave him quite enough of my feeling while he was alive to answer for it. I find I've none left over for the news of his dying," and she picked up her pen again, and the matter, so far as Martha ever saw, was closed for good. On quiet evenings, when the fire had burned low and Eleanor had gone up to bed, and Charlotte sat with her needlework forgotten in her lap, she would sometimes ask Martha to tell it again, the loose stone, the seam her thumb had found almost by accident, the letter that had changed the shape of everything. "You could have put it back," Charlotte said once, echoing the same question she'd asked on the road to Ashfell, still turning it over, even now, a year and more later. "Any other maid in England would have put it back." "Any other maid in England might have," Martha agreed, "but I'd grown very tired, my lady, of only ever opening the doors I was told I was permitted to open. It seemed that night as good a time as any to stop." Outside, the wind moved over the moor the way it always had, indifferent and constant, carrying the smell of wet heather in through the half-open window, and the new house held its warmth and its honesty, the way the old one had once held its secrets, quietly and completely, and for exactly as long as anyone cared to look after it. Did Martha's quiet courage and Charlotte's refusal to let the truth stay buried leave you holding your breath? There is nothing quite like watching a household's smallest, most overlooked servant become the one thread that unravels a lie 24 years in the making. If this story of hidden letters, a stolen mother, and a maid who dared to open the one door she wasn't meant to touch kept you gripped until the very last page, give it a like to support the channel. Share it with anyone who loves a slow-burn mystery with teeth. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell, so you never miss the next story worth staying up for. Let me know in the comments which moment made your heart stop.